Well, good afternoon, everyone. I don't have any visual aids, so I do hope that you are all well caffeinated. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my forthcoming book, but before I do that, I actually want to take a moment and say thank you so much to Jessica and to Brian, and also to Tim and to Lexi, and also to the Mulay Hisham Foundation. This is a very wonderful opportunity, and I just want to say what a joy it has been to be in this very collegial kind of environment. I have very much enjoyed the interdisciplinary, cross-regional, cross-topic kind of foci that everyone is bringing, and it's a real opportunity and a really wonderful environment, so thank you for thinking to include me. So the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to read portions of the book and sections from the book, not necessarily in the order in which they appear in the book, but my project is called Everyday Piety, Islam and Economy in Jordan, and the book's coming out in January from Cornell University Press. Beyond that, I understand some folks here have some good Googling skills, and so you might have seen my name associated with Syrian refugees. Since I finished my dissertation in 2011, of course the Syrian refugee crisis came onto the scene, and Jordan became a place where now upwards of around 1 million refugees have found a place to reside, at least temporarily, that's hoped. And so I have spent the last year and a half or so focusing on Syrian refugees, and I'm happy to talk more about the research that I've done, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to focus a little bit on the forthcoming book. So, no further ado. When I began my research in Amman, Jordan in 2007, it did not take long before I began hearing people discuss their economic practices in terms of the real Islam, or al-Islam al-Haqiqi, or al-Islam al-Haqiqi. Ammanis debating Islamic authenticity and legitimacy of practice centered around reference to an objectified, singular, monolithic idea of an Islam, which resided somehow out there and was understood to exist without complication, interpretation, or influence. At the same time, the content of this real Islam was highly disputed, with limited agreement amongst Ammanis. And when I asked a friend of mine about the translation and etymology of the real Islam, she replied, "We never refer to Islam as anything else. Islam is Islam, it hasn't changed, and it never will. It is the real Islam." But these explanations frustrated me. Where was this real Islam? How did you know if you had found it? How do you know if it's real? Perhaps most importantly, what forms of Islam were not real? Furthermore, how can I make sense of this public normativity of a real Islam when everyone seemed to have something fundamentally different to say about it in conversations together, particularly in regard to their economic practices? It became clear to me that the real Islam was particularly tied to how Ammanis engaged in their everyday economic practices. So prior to fieldwork, of course, I had read what many other scholars had to say about the real Islam. A lot of the literature points to the idea that Islam is a discursive tradition. It's the cultivation of subjectivities that align with doctrine, that there are Islamic cultures, and sometimes very many of them. Islam was presented often in the literature as a set of rules or a set of values that derive quite literally from text. Islam is doctrine, they said, and Muslims are those who adhere to such doctrine. This is often understood as orthodoxy. And as one scholar wrote, "There's so much Islam in the study of Muslims." But what I found is that this literature didn't easily align with what I was seeing in the field. Instead, I found everyday piety was all about these moments of debate and negotiation, about ambivalences and contradictions. I found that people were much more often believing as they lived, rather than living as they believed. And I found that this was particularly true in the economy. Many Muslims in Amman struggle deeply with the challenge of living their daily lives in a modern economy that requires them to purchase various goods and services, to have a bank account, to use a credit card, and perhaps even to invest in stocks or business ventures. They are concerned with engaging in economic practices that are somehow really Islamic, but they are often uncertain and anxious as to what that should look like because public opinion on these issues varies greatly, not only in Amman, but throughout the Muslim world. Furthermore, other factors complicate these aspirations for a real Islam, especially when it comes to issues of gender and class. Taken together, these uncertainties and anxieties reveal an underlying desire to firmly engage in contemporary economic life and to do so with an Islamic authenticity, or a sense of realness. So Muslims in urban Amman resolve their moral uncertainties and these anxieties for a real Islamic economic life in two ways. One, they engage in efforts that mark their economic practices as distinctly Islamic. Economic practices of all kinds, from gambling at a casino, and actually the opening vignette to the book is an ethnographic case of a woman, a middle-aged woman in Amman, recounting how she went to Las Vegas in 1969, and she's walking through describing, what the casino looks like, and she's with her older brother Ahmed, and Ahmed gives her a nickel and tells her to put it in the slot and to play the nickel slots. And she goes, I didn't know what to do, so I pulled the lever. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. She's like, and I won, and she won all this money, right? So there's this kind of story about gambling at a casino and this Muslim girl that plays out earlier on in the text. So economic practices of all kinds, from gambling at a casino and banking and finance to dining out during Ramadan and wearing the hijab, are subject to scrutiny and Sharia-based judgments regarding their authenticity or their asserted realness. Economic practices are subject to all sorts of Islamizing. So that's the first part of the argument, Islamizing of economic activity. The second part of the argument is that Muslims in urban Amman are thinking about Islam and acting on it in ways that reflect economic calculations, which include evaluations of value, profit, and risk, rationalization of processes and outcomes, audits, audit culture, performance indicators, or other ways of judging and assessing actions in religious life. These calculative agencies make Islamic piety measurable and accessible. There's a simultaneous Islamizing of economic practices and an economizing of Islamic pious practice as well. So these fields of economic action and piety merge when Ammanis fuse neoliberalism and their Islamic practice. This is resulting in what I'm calling, this moment of co-production, is what I'm calling neoliberal piety. So I have a short description of neoliberalism that, just for purposes of the moment, I'm going to pass by, but I can certainly come back to in the discussion if that's of interest. So neoliberalism, at first blush, may seem unrelated to one's Islamic piety. But in my research, I found that in urban Amman, the challenges and opportunities between economic life and Islam are pronounced. The act of obtaining cash is questioned for its Islamicness, and charitable giving is infused with religious intention. Fashion options and skirts and tops is something to be altered and Islamized. Ammanis wrestle with the Islamicness of a bank account or a credit card for heightened consumer spending. Neoliberal piety is also social, which creates public pressures to eat certain foods at certain restaurants at certain times during Ramadan, and to defend a relationship between the fabric on a woman's head with the moral fabric of her being. These challenges and opportunities are further intensified by the proliferation of compulsory schooling, ubiquitous mass media, and regional and global popular culture. Ammanis are unable to avoid the presence and pressures of neoliberal influences on their lives and lifestyles. Neoliberal piety, I argue, emerges because neoliberalism and Islamic piety share similar temporal sensibilities. Both produce a sense of shortcoming and a desire for more profit, more gain, and greater expansion into new spaces and new markets. As the thinking goes, just as one must calculate and work towards ever-elusive higher rates of profit, like in capitalist kinds of logics, one can and should work to attain a commensurable spiritual reward. Simply put, there's never enough money, there's never enough monetary or spiritual gain, and such pursuits remain unfulfilled even as they prompt further action and new aims. This relentless striving towards profits and blessings and rewards and the avoidance of punishment and hellfire is the archetypal reflection of neoliberal piety. Neoliberal piety prompts both Islamized economic practice in the dreams of higher levels of profits and economized Islamic practice in the objective of more rewards. The desire to practice, quote, the real Islam is equivalent to the pursuit of ever-increasing profit. It is a primary motivator and aim for action. I argue that this is the main reason that Ammanis report an anxiety and a need to express the real Islam publicly and authentically. In fact, the commodification of the future, Potterai has written about this quite a bit, has enabled futures markets and financial trading and has affected contemporary Islam as well. Calculations of sin, of forgiveness, and eternal rewards have come to dominate decision-making processes as the influence of neoliberal piety spreads. One can calculate one's own prospects for eternity. By extension, individuals can then make adjustments in worldly practice to better be assured of Jannah, or paradise. This extends to risk management into the afterlife, based on the calculative principles of the Hadith and the Sunnah. The successful penetration of calculative agencies in the marketplace, which prove generally predictable and reliable, has lent credence to their use in Islamic practices. So that's the first kind of part of the argument that I want to put forth. So to understand a malleability in and between belief and practice, I'm utilizing a tripartite model. This is unusual for anthropologists to start invoking models, but I promise it will have a kind of resonance for those anthropologists out there. The first part consists of the religious activities and the rituals that individuals perform in public. Social scientists have collectively and in the literature referred to these as orthopraxy, a word deriving from ancient Greek, referencing correct actions and correct practices. The second part of pious practice is then doctrine, which is, I'm asserting a set of values, frequently normative, that individuals hold as the essential tenets of Islam. And then the third element is orthodoxy, or how I'm using it here is as individually held belief. I realize that considering orthodoxy as such may surprise some. I'm not trying to be intentionally provocative today. It's just seeming to happen. For some writers on Islam, orthodoxy is defined in terms of adherence to doctrine. So Lara Deeb, Saba Mahmood, a lot of anthropologists have written on this. However, with a tripartite construction, I aim to interject a conceptual space for internal agreement and disagreement, which is consonant with person-centered constructions of neoliberal piety. To define orthodoxy as adherence to doctrine overlooks many of the important ways by which individuals may reject or dismiss certain doctrinal precepts while at the same time still considering themselves practitioners of the real Islam. Multiple verses in the Quran emphasize how the interpretation of Sharia is ultimately a matter of individual responsibility and choice, and Al-Naim has written about this, for example, and this tripartite framework provides such a space. Historically speaking, Islam has insisted more on orthopraxy than orthodoxy. As Wilfred Cantwell Smith points out, quote, "There is no word meaning orthodox in any Islamic language. The word usually translated orthodox, Sunni, actually means something more like orthoprax, if we may use such a term. A good Muslim is, therefore, one whose commitment may be expressed in practical terms that conform to an accepted code." This is illustrated, end quote, this is illustrated by the fact that the learning and correct recitation of sacred texts in Arabic, even when local populations do not use Arabic as a non-sacred language for everyday life, is considered more important oftentimes than the comprehension of their meaning. Furthermore, parts of Islamic doctrine have changed over time, and this is something I think that the literature has often not emphasized and not brought to light that frequently, and I think it's really important. Contemporary Islam in urban Jordan reflects different doctrinal emphases and content and economic practices than were present at the religion's advent. It's also the case that many doctrinal aspects are still being worked out in the economic sphere. And so in the book I focus on Islamic banking and finance, which is a very new sphere, a very recent sphere in which the question of doctrine has started to become applied and worked out only since roughly the 1970s in the way that it's understood today. And in the case of Jordan, the first Islamic bank didn't open until 1987, and I think other countries have had even more shallow or recent histories with Islamic banking and finance. And so these questions of doctrine are very much in flux and are very much being worked out in a way that I think makes this tripartite model of piety particularly applicable. So using ethnographic comparisons and case studies such as Islamic banking and finance, this study examines how Muslims in Oman engage in calculated processes of identity construction around this idea of the real Islam. They use a variety of forms through daily choices about what to wear, where to bank, as well as whom to marry and who to date, where to work, and how to pray. These everyday actions reveal the complex calculations through which Omanis Islamize their economic selves and economize their Islamic selves in the public sphere, justifying and showcasing their everyday piety through complex constructions of authentic Islamic piety that inform both their professional and their personal lives. So in addition to the banking and finance components, I also look at consumption more generally. And so one case that is easy to reference is that of Laylatul Qadr. So during the month of Ramadan, it's believed widely, relatively in consensus, but not 100%, that it was the 27th night of Ramadan that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. And this idea of Laylatul Qadr, the night of power, comes from a verse in the Quran which says that everything you do that night is as though it is being done for 1,000 months, or 83.33 years. And so I actually have had friends discuss how during Laylatul Qadr they will focus on sort of honing their most pious practices as a way to obtain the most rewards, right? And maximizing of the evening, and a way to sort of calculate their profits or potential rewards of thawab from that night. So they'll read the Quran an extra time, or pray an extra time, or sleep in the mosque is a common practice as well in Amman. So the history of Amman, which comprises chapter 2 in the book, I will just say that the shallow history and the emergence of what I argue is a Muslim middle class has played a really important role in this development of contemporary neoliberal piety. So Amman's history of relatively rapid transition from a small farming community to a modern Islamic capital city has important implications for the public representations of Islam and the public ethics of its expression by Muslim residents. The city's swift structural changes in the economic and social realms set the stage for the ways in which Islamic piety is both contingent and negotiated. This history also has implications for the Islamization of economic practice and the economization of Islamic practice as they relate to other actions characteristic of a Muslim middle class, such as personal consumerism, economic production, local economic interests and agendas, and nationalism and political mobilization around, for example, the outcomes of the Arab Spring. So in the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the political implications for the construction of piety. The multifaceted and heavily contested ways that Ammanis approach these processes hold out hope for Jordan as a place branded by Islamic diversity, moderation, and cohesion. This ethnography reveals the ways by which neoliberalism holds up distinct and highly attractive promises to Ammanis in the post-Islamist era. All Muslims, even those at the margins, can participate in global economic relationships. I mean, this is the promise of neoliberalism in many ways, that even those at the margins, by participating in economic activity, have a way to participate in global flows, whether informational or consumer-based, commodity-based, for example. They can find satisfaction in heightened levels and types of consumption, and seek the fulfillment and the promises of returns on both economic and Islamic investments. These economizing logics affirm that many, if not most Muslims in urban Amman, do not hold a view of economic practices as a menace or as a morally corrupt aspect of life, but rather as the very means by which they can attain happiness, security, and the good life. Further, such economic practices also promise the good Islamic life, complete with spiritual happiness and eternal security. So in the few minutes that I have left, I just want to comment briefly on the Arab Spring. I've published in another piece this idea that the Arab Spring in Jordan was largely considered a failure or a washout. It was a disappointment, according to some analysts. And there were a couple of protests of note that were quite important. But what I argued was that the middle class, which is aspirationally quite large, even if economically quite diverse, engendered a sense that what was happening in Jordan, even as imperfect as it was much, much better than what was happening in neighboring countries. And so there was this kind of calculus of stability that many middle-class Muslims were embracing that kept the Arab Spring from really taking off in Jordan. As a result, the Jordanian context much more closely approximates conditions of post-Islamism, which represents an endeavor to fuse religiosity and rights, faith and freedom, Islam and liberty. It's an attempt to turn the underlying principles of Islamism on its head by emphasizing rights instead of duties, plurality in place of singular authoritative voice, and historicity rather than fixed scripture, and the future instead of the past. Post-Islamism, as witnessed in Amman, is therefore one way to characterize contemporary Islamic practice. The insertion of Islamic ethics and norms into economic practices and the economization of Islamic practices create a middle class that's pushing for contemporary, modern, market-friendly enterprises that dominate public religious life, civil society, and nationalist inclusions. Islamic nationalism in Jordan is contingent on economic practices and economizing processes with calculative agencies. As a result, we can see that the Arab Spring failed to materialize in Jordan in a large part because of a lack of political interest in instability for the sake of anticipated rewards, which are derived from historical precedent, contemporary demography, and religious pluralism. Jordanians simply could not see the benefits when calculated in relation to the risks of instability, another civil war, and enhancing and deepening the cleavages that are already present. Accepting the Hashemite rulers during the Arab Spring as an expression of nationalism was an outcome of calculative agencies and processes of economizing. The idea that Islamic nationalism in Jordan is contingent on middle-class interests and economic practices is made clear in a number of other examples that I will have to pass on sharing in a moment. So, thank you very much.